This is Julianne Moore, an award-winning actress. This is Lex Luthor, billionaire and sworn enemy of Superman. And this is Richard Dawkins. He's an evolutionary biologist and author of several best-selling books dealing with the subject of the character and existence of God. And finally, this is Gorr the God Butcher, the main villain in the Marvel Cinematic Universe movie, Thor, Love and Thunder. You may not know it yet, but all four of these people or characters have something very important in common. And today, you're going to find out what that is, and more importantly, how it's related to something called the Great Controversy. Let's jump right in by learning about this handsome young man right here. And as I said, his name is Gorr the God Butcher. And here's a look at his bio from the Marvel database. It says, Gorr the God Butcher was born on a planet with no name, almost every day on the brink of starvation. He was taught to trust in the gods, but they never answered his prayers. At an early age, his mother and father died, leaving Gorr to fend for himself in the harsh environment. Years later, he married and then fathered some children. However, most of them died. Gorr's pregnant mate Ara was killed during an earthquake, and one by one his children perished until he was left with one son, Agar, who also eventually dies. Now don't miss this. This poor guy grew up with nothing. He prayed to the gods and they never answered his prayers. His parents died at an early age, his pregnant wife dies in an earthquake, and all of his children die. If you didn't guess, obviously this is a fictitious story. But you have to admit, this scenario is really no different from what countless people have experienced throughout human history. Starvation, natural disasters, death of loved ones, pain, suffering, loss, all while feeling like their prayers are going unanswered. And for many, especially in our time, they react like Gorr the God Butcher, who gave up hope and outwardly expressed his unbelief by saying that they, meaning gods, don't hear your prayers because there are no gods. There never were. In other words, much like so many people in the real world, when facing tragedy and feeling like God is not there, Gorr became an atheist. And when he started sharing his doubts, he was exiled, or some may say, excommunicated from his church, even being stoned for blasphemy. Now let's switch gears to real life for a minute. It was about 7 years ago that I came across an interview with award-winning actress Julianne Moore. One of the things that was discussed in this interview was Julianne's newfound lack of belief, as she, much like Gorr the God Butcher, had abandoned her belief in God. The title of this article says it all. Julianne Moore stopped believing in God after her mother's death. In this interview, it says Moore opened up about her mom, Ann Smith's 2009 death at age 68 from septic shock. We don't know why it happened, the actress revealed. She went to bed and it turned out she had a huge bacterial infection. Sadly, her mother had died unexpectedly. And when this happened, she says that she learned that when her mother died 5 years ago, that there was no there. She went on to say, structure is all imposed. We impose order and narrative on everything in order to understand it. Otherwise, there's nothing but chaos. In other words, when she looks at reality now, what she sees is that there's no heaven, there's no God, there's just chaos. Because in her mind, if there is a God who has all this power, then obviously he should have intervened and saved her mother's life. Enter Lex Luthor, another fictitious character who, much like Gorr the God Butcher, has something to say about the existence of God as it relates to relieving pain and suffering. In the 2016 movie Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, listen to what Lex Luthor has to say.
The problem of evil in the world. Problem of you on top of everything else. You above all. Because that's what God is. Horus, Apollo, Jehovah. Because God is tribal. God takes sides. No man in the sky intervened when I was a boy to deliver me from daddy's fist and abominations. I figured out way back. If God is all powerful, he cannot be all good. And if he is all good, then he cannot be all powerful. And neither can you be.
And there it is, the dilemma that so many people face. If God is all powerful, then he cannot be all good. And if he is all good, then he cannot be all powerful, because then he would fix everything. Whether it's Gorr the God Butcher, Julianne Moore, Lex Luthor, or the millions of other atheists in the world today, the majority of people who reject God do so not because of the so-called scientific evidence. It's usually because of some type of pain or trauma that they have seen or experienced. And since they can't understand why a loving and all-powerful God won't just fix everything, like Gorr the God Butcher, they throw God out with the bathwater. But wait a minute, I thought Gorr was a God Butcher. If Gorr is an atheist, how can he be a killer of gods? And what does that even have to do with the great controversy? Well, as the story goes, after Gorr is ostracized from his people, wandering his planet alone, he witnesses a pair of battling gods plunge out of the sky and crash land nearby. Shocked by the realization that gods did exist, Gorr was enraged when the gold-armored god begged for help. Gorr then says to this god, "Where were you when my children were starving? When my wife was screaming for your help? When my mother was being butchered like an animal?" Gorr then takes the god's weapon to kill the gold-armored god, then vowed to seek vengeance against all gods for never answering his prayers and set out to kill them all. This is the moment that he goes from just being Gorr to being Gorr the God Butcher. And this is what he vows to do.
The only ones who gods care about is themselves.
So this is my vow.
All gods will die.
That's right. All gods must die. In other words, he goes from being an atheist to being what is called a mesotheist. This article from Screen Rant puts it this way. It's quite possible that Gorr the God Butcher might be the most dangerous and personally damaging villain Thor the God of Thunder has ever faced. Armed with the lethal all-black necrosword, Gorr subscribed to a philosophy of mesotheism, meaning he had an intense hatred of any and all gods after enduring an incredibly tragic personal loss that came after his prayers went unanswered. As it said, what we're seeing in this comic is a deep-seated hatred for anything related to God. And make no mistake about it, even though Gorr the God Butcher and Lex Luthor are fictitious, the hatred and animosity directed towards God is not. What people will see when they watch the movie Thor Love and Thunder is nothing new. It will simply be the latest example of the use of a medium to communicate a specific worldview to enlist more of humanity in a war that I have come to know as the Great Controversy. And if you don't fully understand what the war is about, then I want to give you a little insight by reading from a book that completely changed my views on God. The book is named The Great Controversy, and on page 568, it says this: "It is Satan's constant effort to misrepresent the character of God, the nature of sin, and the real issues at stake in the Great Controversy. His sophistry lessens the obligation of the divine law and gives men license to sin. At the same time, he causes them to cherish false conceptions of God so that they regard him with fear and hate rather than with love. The cruelty inherent in his own character is attributed to the Creator. It is embodied in systems of religion and expressed in modes of worship. Thus, the minds of men are blinded, and Satan secures them as his agents to war against God." If you didn't catch it, it's a simple three-step process. Step 1 is to misrepresent the character of God. Step 2 is to cherish false conceptions of God. And finally, step 3 is to war against God. A simple three-step plan that has been carried out over and over again by Satan to turn humanity against God. It's no different than what took place in the Garden of Eden when Lucifer used the serpent as the first medium, or the first form of media, to share his perverted views regarding the character of God. Eve listened intently because Satan used three things that are present in every blockbuster movie to break down her guard and get his message into her consciousness: a script, music, and special effects. Don't believe me? Let's take a look. This is a quote from an old article that gives more insight into what really happened at that tree. It says, "Eve found herself gazing with mingled curiosity and admiration upon the fruit of the forbidden tree. Now was Satan's opportunity. He addressed her as though he was able to divine or read her thoughts. Thus, with soft and pleasant words and with a musical voice, he addressed the wondering Eve. She was startled to hear a serpent speak, but she was amazed, for she knew that to the serpent God had not given the power of speech. Lucifer had prepared his script, and it piqued Eve's curiosity. He spoke with a musical voice, looking like a talking serpent. Satan used music, dialogue, and special effects to make it look like a serpent was talking. I mean, think about it. Can snakes talk? Obviously, that serpent was not really talking. However, Satan, like a ventriloquist, made it appear like this, and this broke down her guard, and she allowed herself to be indoctrinated with false ideas about the character of God. As a matter of fact, maybe it even looked something like this. Lucifer has been doing this constantly since the Garden of Eden, and he will use whatever medium or media that he can in his attempts to misrepresent the character of God. There's one more person that I want you to meet, and his name is Richard Dawkins. As I already mentioned, he's an evolutionary biologist, author, and professed anti-theist. Notice I didn't say atheist, I said anti-theist, and you'll see exactly what an anti-theist is in just a moment. But before we see that, I want you to read a quote from page 31 of his book entitled The God Delusion. And this is what he has to say about his view of the Judeo-Christian God. It says, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." Now that is a mouthful that describes how most people view God, coming from an atheist that doesn't believe in God, who is also an anti-theist that feels morally compelled to fight against the very idea of God, because he is also a deistheist who believes that God is not wholly good and can even be considered evil, and most likely, he is really just someone like Gorr the God Butcher that hates God and would destroy him if he could. All of this animosity towards God is based in the very roots of atheism, and we can see it in the rise of atheism during the French Revolution, where Jesus Christ was declared to be an impostor, and the rallying cry of the French infidels was "Crush the wretch," meaning Christ. In the past and present war against God in the media, it has always come back to Jesus. And this is clear from the comics on which the movie Thor Love and Thunder are based, as there are multiple scenes depicted that mirror the experiences of Jesus from the Bible. This is one of the scenes from the comics on which the movie is based. In this scene, Gorr whips this God that looks like the popular depictions of Jesus, while mocking him and saying things like, "Does this answer your question, little God?" This so-called God from the comics even calls himself the Lion of Asgard, similar to Christ being called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Gorr declares that his work will be done when all the worlds are free from the tyranny of the heavens. This comic even goes on to depict a crucifixion just like the popular depictions of the crucifixion of Jesus. The movie Thor Love and Thunder will obviously promote the same negative ideas about God. In this article from The Direct, Brad Winderbaum, the head of Marvel Studios streaming, television, and animation, had this to say about the movie. Gorr played by the rules, and so when he realizes he's been betrayed by the gods, he's overtaken by a rage that hits such a fever pitch that he gains an evil ancient power and sets out to rid the universe of these gods who don't take care of their humans. It's obvious that these stories are part of the continued war against the character of God. Whether it was speaking through a serpent in the Garden of Eden, speaking through an anti-theist like Richard Dawkins, or speaking through a comic book or a movie character like Lex Luthor and Gorr the God Butcher. Despite the constant barrage of content that promotes the idea that we should distrust and hate God, the interesting thing is that God does not, nor has he ever, blocked the enemy from saying whatever negative things that he wants to say. God is completely secure in who he is and what his character is, and he has revealed his character through his word and through coming to die for humanity. And if, and only if, we are willing to approach this topic with an open mind, will we be able to see the goodness of his character, even when we don't fully understand everything that he does. So the question today is, what do I think about God? What do you think about God? Do we ever think that God is indifferent to our sufferings? Do we ever think that God is not all good? These are very real questions that we have to sort out individually as Christ and Satan battle for our minds. Romans 8 verse 7 states that the carnal mind is enmity against God, meaning that from the moment we're born, we have a natural hostility towards God that we have to deal with. We have to choose between these conflicting views of God and ultimately decide if we want to spend an eternity with him. The more videos, books, and comics that we consume that promotes negative ideas about the character of God, the more animosity we will have towards him. And conversely, the more videos, audio, and books that we consume that promotes positive ideas about the character of God, the more we will come to appreciate his character and learn to love him. The great controversy is playing out in my mind right now, and it's playing out in your mind as well. So, who will you believe about God's character? Gorr the God Butcher, Lex Luthor, Richard Dawkins? Or will you give God an opportunity to explain himself? He is inviting you today to come and reason together with him. I've dealt with my natural animosity towards God, and I've come to know him and trust him for myself. The invitation is open for you to accept it if you choose to not just listen to one side of this argument, but to give God a chance to share his side. And who knows, maybe you'll find out that he's not as bad as Gorr the God Butcher, Lex Luthor, and Richard Dawkins are making him out to be. If you're interested in hearing the other side, then check the description below and I will make sure to get you a free copy of The Great Controversy. And I promise you, if you take the time to read it, you will not be disappointed. The only question is, are you willing to give it a chance? Hope to see you again.